To make a savoury quiche, the first thing we're going to need to do is make a short crust pastry. So the first thing we need to do is get 150 grams of plain flour. We're going to sieve that into a large mixing bowl with a pinch of salt. So by sieving it, you're making sure there's no lumps in there, and you're also adding some air into the mixture, so adding some volume. We're then going to add half of the amount of flour, so we had 150 grams of flour, and we're going to use the butter and lard, so 2 types of fat combined to create 75 grams of fat. This way that we will be using the lard to give it some texture, and the butter gives it some texture but also gives it a lovely flavour. The lard, if you don't want to use lard because you're vegetarian, you can use Trex, and Trex is a white vegetable fat that is hard like this. So we put those in. So first of all, we're going to use a table knife to start cutting the fat into the flour until it's small enough that we can get our fingers in there, and use the tips of our fingertips to combine those two together. So this is the rubbing in method, and it's used because it creates a nice crumbly texture to the outcome. It's important to use a cold environment in which to create your pastry, and use your hands being very cold across the tips of your fingers, just lifting and rubbing as you go until you get it into a breadcrumb mixture. And this takes a little bit of time. Have a bit of patience. Another way to save yourself time is to put it all into the food processor if you've got one, and just turn that on, and within seconds it's literally like breadcrumbs. So that's a quick way to do it. Now at this time we would normally, once it's into breadcrumbs, we would normally just add some very cold water to bind it together, but I'm going to make an enriched dough. So I'm simply going to add an egg into the mixture, and I'm going to continue binding that here. And as you can see, it brings it all together very, very quickly. Once your dough is bound together, you need to take it out or finish it off from the bowl, bring it together in your hands, and just put that into some cling film or something, and that needs to stay in the fridge for about 20 minutes to allow the fats to kind of reharden and for it to rest. Whilst your pastry is resting in the fridge, you need to turn your oven on to about 190, gas mark 5, so it can start to preheat and get to the right temperature. It's really important you preheat your oven, otherwise the fats will start to melt and you'll end up with a soggy pastry rather than a pastry that will set quite quickly once it goes into the oven. Also, whilst the dough for the pastry is resting in the fridge, I'm going to cut some bacon using some kitchen scissors, so they're not used for everything. They're washed every time they're used to stop cross-contamination in the dishwasher to get a nice high temperature on them. And I'm going to cut this bacon into my frying pan. I'm going to leave off as much of the fat as possible on the edge. And I'm going to cut up some mushrooms as well, and I'm going to pre-cook in the frying pan the bacon and the mushrooms, ready to go into the quiche. And that's then just about done. When your pastry's had time to rest in the fridge, get it out onto a floured surface, and then you need to just make sure it's coated in flour, your rolling pin is coated in flour, and just keep turning it to get it into a nice round shape. You want... Okay, so I've now finished rolling it. It's about 3 to 4 millimeters thick. I'm going to be placing it now into my tray. Now my fluted tray with the loose bottom, which is for quiche making, my one is a little bit too big, so I'm not going to use that today. I'm going to use just a simple baking tray, round one, which I might use for cakes. So I'm just going to place my pastry into here, lightly press it down into the sides, then I'm going to lift it up, so I'm going to hold the base and I'm going to use a knife, a chopping motion downwards, just to cut off the edges. Now you can use that pastry to make a little something nice for yourself, some jam tarts, something else, whatever you like. I'm also going to flute the edges of my pastry by putting my knuckles on the edge there, and I'm just going to press between to get that fluted effect on the edge of my pastry tin. Now the first thing you need to do with your pastry is make sure that you cook it through a little bit before it has the filling put into it. So whilst it's like this, I'm going to put some fork marks in the base, which will help the heat to cook all the way through the base and help to keep it down as well, so it doesn't rise up. So that's called docking. So that's just forking the bottom. And then I'm going to use some baking paper and I'm going to place that inside and weight that down with some baking beans, ceramic baking beans. Now not everybody's got these, and that's absolutely fine. To be honest, the way I usually do this at home is I would normally use just a bit of tin foil scrunched up just to hold out the edges so that it stays in place whilst it's cooking. So I'm going to place that in the oven for around about 10 to 15 minutes to see it cooked through on the outside. Okay. So whilst that's been in the oven, doing what we call baking blind, which simply means baking it without any filling inside, we have now got the bottom dried out a little bit more, ready to cook through so you don't end up with a soggy bottom. It's worth remembering to do this for any tarts or quiches or anything where you need to have a wet filling in the main part of it. I'm now going to try and remove the baking beans, but remember, lift it from each corner and it will be very, very hot. Not the paper, the baking beans themselves. So you may need to just actually rest them on the surface for a while before trying to put them back into their pot. Now, as you can see from the tart, it's still got some areas that look a little bit damp at the base. So I'm actually going to put that back in the oven for another 5 minutes to dry out that base a little bit more. Without be putting it back in the oven without the baking beans this time, just so that the base can dry out a bit more. Whilst the tart's back in the oven for a further 5 minutes just to dry out the base, I'm now going to use another bowl and just create what's going to go in the middle. So we're going to use 2 eggs, break each one at a time. Place your rubbish in your debris bowl and add it to your bowl. We do each one at a time to make sure that they're not off and to make sure we don't get any shell in it. It's always a good safe way to be sure. And the debris bowl, place that into the main bowl. I'm now going to add my milk to this. So I'm using 125 ml of milk to the 2 eggs. It's important to get the ratio correct so that you don't end up with a filling that doesn't set. The eggs are the part that's going to set it. So as the eggs heat up in the oven, they will start to set because the proteins start to unravel and they do what we call coagulate. So we're going to mix those two together to make sure they're well combined. I'm going to add some salt and some pepper, so some seasoning. And then this mixture is ready to go. So I've got my egg mixture, egg and milk with seasoning. I've got some grated cheddar cheese, and I've also got my bacon and mushrooms, which I've pre-cooked by frying them off a little bit. So I've now got my pastry case back out of the oven again, having had that little bit of extra time to dry out the base and cook it through. I'm now going to place my mushroom and bacon at the base and spread that out so it's nice and even. Otherwise one person might get some and another person not get any when you cut it up later. Okay. I'm then going to place on here a little bit of my cheese. About half, I'd say. Half the cheese. And then I'm going to pour in the filling. But be careful not to go too far. If it seems like it's going to overflow, don't add it all. That's just perfect actually. And then I'm going to place a little bit more cheese on the top to make sure it gives it that nice golden colour as it cooks through. This is now going to be placed in the oven for about 30 to 40 minutes until it's risen and golden and all set. We'll know if we give it a jiggle and the middle stays firm. I've placed it onto another tray here to put into the oven because now it's got a filling. I thought it'd be easier to transport it this way. And here it is, the completed quiche. Lightly browned on top, slightly risen, and if you give it a wobble, it's not going to move. So the egg has coagulated and set it in the oven.